Hello, everyone. I think we will begin. I would invite those standing, if you can join us. Okay, seems like okay. Excellent. So my name is Masha Cemma, and I'm Open Science Lead at the Office of Chief Science Advisor of Canada, Dr. Mona Niemer. She'll be joining us later today, and will provide some remarks as well. It's an extreme privilege to be moderating this session. I'm awestruck by the panelists today who are joined us, and really, really impressed with the day overall. So thank you to the Neuro for hosting this symposium and having such international talent around the table. So we have two presentations today from Alain Schuhl and Suzana Petanceska. And I'll do a very brief introduction for the two of them, and then they will do the around 10-minute presentation, and we'll take the questions together after both our presentations end. I have a few questions for them, but if there's lots of questions in the audience, I'll skip those. So we're going to start with Alain. Dr. Alain Schuhl is a physicist and a specialist of the magnetic properties of matter. He's joining us from the French National Center for Scientific Research, or CNRS, where he is number 2, or Deputy CEO for Research. He coordinates the activities of the 10 CNRS Institute, promotes interdisciplinarity, and organizes partnership on the regional, national, European, and international level. And just a quick note about CNRS, for those who are not familiar with the organization, it's been in existence for 80 years and actually just celebrated its 80th year anniversary last month. It has around 32,000 researchers and technicians working there. And the researchers at the CNRS are government scientists, really, but all the labs are collaborative labs with the university scientists. Our second presenter is Dr. Suzana Petanceska. She's a pharmacologist and neuroscientist with deep expertise in Alzheimer's disease. Her research focused on the role of disrupted sterile metabolism in Alzheimer's disease pathogenesis, as well as on the mechanism by which estrogen and cholesterol-lowering drugs might exert neuroprotection. She's joining us from the National Institutes of Health, in particular from the National Institute of Aging, where she's senior advisor and program officer in the Division of Neuroscience. There she's leading a number of strategic planning activities related to achieving the research goal of national plan to address Alzheimer's, to both prevent and treat Alzheimer's disease by 2025. So we're really, really pleased to be joined by both of them, and I'll give the floor to Dr. Schuhl.
Thank you, Masha. First, I'd like to thank the organizer to give me the opportunity to present the state of the policy of open science in France. At the same moment in Paris, my president, Antoine Petit, is giving a conference in the National Day of Open Science. There's 2 days of open science, today and tomorrow in Paris, and it will present the new roadmap for open science for the CNRS, just at the same moment. So I will present you the same presentation than him, rapidly. Okay. Is that working? Yes. Okay, open science. Just few words. Why open science? It's for the free dissemination. There is no contradiction between open science and protection. Is open as possible and as close as necessary. The goal is to remove the access barrier while maintaining all copyright protections. And in France, what is important is that all the CNRS labs are joint laboratories with university. So the word on open science should be taken together with the university and research organizations. Okay, so we have 4 legs for our roadmap. So 4 legs, and one, the open science publication, open publication. Our goal in the 5 years from now is to have only 100% of publication in open science. Why 100%? Because less is not enough, and more is difficult to achieve. okay, we know the word for open publication. What is more complicated, and we spoke about that this morning, it's open data and fairization of the research data. What we call fairization is findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. We spoke a little bit this morning about that. That's the second leg. The third leg is to develop and to promote text and data mining tools to be able to make research by using these tools of text and data mining. And the fourth one, which is for me the more important, you will not change anything if you don't change the way you evaluate the individual researcher, and you have to put open agent in the evaluations. So just few words that we are speaking about France, and CNRS has 55,000 publications, and you see the repartition between the three bigger editors, which have about 60% of the publication, and the others. And here is at the organization of the CNRS. Masha told that there is 10 institutes. Yes, we have 10 institutes from nuclear physics to earth and mathematics. And you see that what is in yellow and green, it's what is in open science, and what is here, the other color is not open publications. You can see there is a big difference between community. If you look in nuclear physics, you are 70% of publication in open science, while in chemistry, you have only 30% of publication. And the solution is not the same for all the community. You will have different solutions for biology and for physics, or for humanities and social science. What we are developing, we double the resources we give to our open archive, which name is AL, and we will incentive all the scientists to put their publication inside this open archive. What is also important, what we believe not in only one solution, we believe in what we call the bibliodiversity. That's what we have here in this picture, a view of several editing platform, which has non-profit editing platform, which are what we call open access publication platform. And these are very different models. You have AP review, you have a standard platform, you have things like that in different disciplines. And we want to promote for each disciplines, we want to promote for each field his own platform. And that's the point after. Now I'm going to the second leg, which is the data. Okay, we want to develop the fair culture for data management and sharing. The practice of the scientific community are different from one discipline to another. CNRS is a research organization, but at the same time we are working with the ANR, which is with the French National Research Agency, which is giving money to the researcher, and we are working on this point. And now they oblige for each project which receive money from them to make a data management plan, to think to a data management plan, because when you think to a way to reuse the data, you think at the same time as a way to open the data is the same way to think. You have to think which data you have to use, you have to put the metadata to be able to reuse the data. And then the third point is where you have to store the data, either in your computer or in the very, very big data center. Okay, so this, we are working with all the community in this point. We have solution which has been developed, like OPDOR, which text and data mining solutions. Today, for me, that's the third leg. It's also very complicated because you have researchers who are working on their field in text and data mining, but they are working with their own corpus, and the programs they are making are not really usable for other researchers. It's really very research programs. We want to develop accessible accessible tools which will be accessible for even non-specialist researchers to be able to make some analysis of, for example, text for publication or for data. If for publication we know where we have to go, for data we have some idea. Here we're just at the beginning of the thinking of this point, but I think we have to develop that at the same time. And the last point, which is more important for me, it's evaluation of researcher, evaluation and open data, because if at the end the evaluation is done just by Excel program, and you have not, you just look at a number and not look at what is inside, what is the quality of the research, you will lose everything we want to do with open sciences. So we signed in July. I did arrive at this position in April, and in July we signed the DORA Declaration on Research Assessments, and especially this Article 4 and 5 for individual research evaluation. And we, in CNRS, we have 10 institutes, but we have also 41 specialists, 41 evaluation commission in each disciplines, in each field, in each sub-disciplines. And we want that each of this commission will use these 4 principles, which are very simple. First, you have to evaluate the results and not the facts that have been published in a very good review. It's better to have a good article in bad review than a bad article in a good review. Second, it's for each of the productions cited in the evaluation, the researcher must explain their scope. It's better to have some text and explanation from the researcher than a complete list of the scientific production. For example, if I take my example, I have many publications, but there is publication where my contribution is very big, and other publications where my contribution is very small, and you cannot see that in a list of all the publications. So it's more important to have reduced text when you explain what is your contribution and how you have been involved in the research. So the third point is all type of production can be part on the evaluation. So you can use programs, algorithm, preprint, everything, and then the commission should be able to look at what is in the results and what is as a scientific. It's better than just to look at the numbers. And the fourth one, which is important for us, that scientific production cited which has been used for the evaluation should be accessible in open access. We will not accept any publication for the evaluation which is not accessible in open access. So, and at the same time, we have to add 3 points which are important: a training and dissemination plan. That's we have to explain what we are going to all the labs and all the university to explain that. We also have an international strategy. At the end of the month, we have a big event for the 80th anniversary of the CNRS, and there is during the day an international symposium, and one of the roundtable will be on the open science, and we'll have 6 person speaking about open science, one from the Chinese Science Academy, one from Chile, one from Germany, one from Africa. So there will be a panel to look as a way to make open science everywhere in the world, and I think it's very important to have an international common view about that. And the last point, which is very important for me also, it's what I can say. We are all I don't know how to say in English, but we are all a little bit schizophrenic. I mean, we want to develop open science, but when we have a very, very good result, we want to be sure it will be published in a very good review. So this will work only if any of the researcher will be involved in the road, will be convinced, and so we have to convince everything that this is a necessary revolution. And I think that all I have to do, it's just 11 minutes. It's okay?
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd love to thank the Neuro, Al Edwards, for the kind invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I feel like a fish in water. How do I now advance the slides? Well, let's bring the presentation.
Presentation.
Okay.
Yours is already on.
Yeah.
This one?
Yes. So I'll share with you some of the recent development at the National Institute on Aging and how we support open science, again, not as an end in and of itself, but as a tool to advance discovery, accelerate discovery and therapy development. So in 2012, the US launched its first national plan to address Alzheimer's. It has 5 goals. The first goal is prevent and treat Alzheimer's related dementias by 2025. You understand, of course, in drug development terms, 13 years is the day after tomorrow. And this was happening while we were accruing phase 3 clinical failures. We don't have any effective disease-modifying therapies, and there is a growing realization, of course, that the disease is enormously complex and that effective therapy would require really deconstructing that complexity and developing a very robust precision medicine approach to translation. So the National Institute on Aging is the largest public funder of Alzheimer's research and research on related dementias in the US. So after the launch of the national plan to address Alzheimer's, a couple of years later, there was an enormous boost in public funding for Alzheimer's research. The NIH budget for AD and ADRD research has quadrupled since 2015, from a little bit over 600 million to a little bit over 2.4 billion. So as the NIA, as a leading agency on AD/ADR research, was tasked to actually convene a community, a multi-stakeholder community. So we brought together experts, innovators, advocates through in 3 strategic planning research summits to really rethink everything about AD research. And thanks to the boost in public funding, we really pressed on it. So I'm highlighting here some of the overarching and key messages from the 3 research summits. And you can appreciate that half of them have to do with enabling rapid and broad dissemination of data, biospecimens, and research tools, and enabling and promoting open science, ending with the, very importantly, changing the incentives across the academic, publishing, and funding environments to enable collaborative, transparent, and reproducible research. So we support research on Alzheimer's soup to nuts, everything from genetics to research on care. And we have, again, thanks to the boost in public funding, been able to do very aggressive and progressive program development. What I will go through today is just highlight NIA's translational research program and the open science translational infrastructure that we have built in the last 6 years. So we support AD therapy development in 2 major ways. First, on the top, we have a pipeline of funding initiatives and opportunities that allow, we provide support to academics, biotech, researchers at large to take something from early stage drug discovery all the way through phase 3. But what we have realized is that it is really necessary to lift all boats, we ought to be putting in place a very robust translational infrastructure to really minimize the guessing and praying and maximize the predicting and testing in therapy development. So we are doing this all the way from the target discovery and validation space to clinical trials, and I'll highlight a couple of these new programs. So the first one in the target discovery space is actually a program that is a component of the Accelerating Medicines Partnership for Alzheimer's Disease. That large program is over 200 million joint investment between NIA, industry, and nonprofit funders. This particular component, funded to the tune of $50 million over 5 years, is a big data systems biology experiment to discover and conduct early validation of the next generation of therapeutic targets for AD using an open science research model. So in its first phase, we funded 6 large cross-disciplinary academic teams, brought together the Sage Bionetworks team as the data coordinating center, and through the development of the data sharing platform that Sage Bionetworks put together, we networked the generation of high-quality human multi-omic data, predictive modeling, and experimental validation to propel these early target insights. Now, so what do we have to show for it? So what have we achieved in the first 5 years? So this has been a fairly robust discovery engine, not just for those who participate in it, but equally, and I would say more importantly, for the greater community at large. So we not only stood up the knowledge portal and an associated web-based interactive platform, Agora, that allows biologists and clinicians actually to interact with the output of all that big data business. But I'm pleased to report that all that wealth, a very wealthy data set, Uber data set or data sets of multi-omic human data from postmortem brain tissue, from plasma samples coming from brain banks, from epidemiologic cohorts, together with the analytical outputs, all that has been made available and is being widely used. So probably this is an outdated statistics that data sets have been accessed by over 3,000 researchers globally, 60% of them coming from academic settings and 40% from biotech and pharma. The final output of the first 5 years was the making available over 500 novel target nominations through that web-based interactive platform, Agora, along with the supporting evidence and an extensive druggability information sheet. So again, this program is entering now its second phase. It is also, I'm not mentioning as one of the deliverables, the couple of hundred research manuscripts, not just by the teams, but by the community at large, and many new disease insight, some of them actually made by researchers outside of the consortium who tapped the data sets and asked a new question or used them to do replication research. The research model is such that we require, by the terms and conditions of funding, that researchers deposit their data sets into the AMP80 knowledge portal post-QC. We allow a few months for QC. There are twice a year data releases through the knowledge portal, and there is no publication embargo on the data sets once they've been released. And we've had a case which we consider a big success, where a group external to the consortium tapped the totally new data sets of whole genome sequence data, asked new questions, and discovered something entirely new, while the folks who produced the data had not had a chance to publish on it yet. So, so the goal here is that this big data infrastructure that Sage Bionetworks developed and is maintaining and evolving is, the goal here is for us to share data throughout all the cycles of data, from raw and processed to analytical results, and ultimately insights, the target predictions. And so the goal is, of course, to not make just data available, but to make them usable. We know how sometimes you get data sets and then you spend a year scratching your head, figuring out what exactly you have in your hand. We are trying with this to promote transparency in reporting and build in and propagate a trust but verify ethos in the community. This is the big data analysis and outputs are really, none of that is established science. Everything is in flux. It's just being invented. So it's really important for the community to, as these teams are pushing out data sets and making discoveries, for everybody else to have a chance to take a look at it and verify these observations. It also, because of how the platform on which the portal is built, and that is the Synapse Informatics platform, and the Agora, which is the result visualizer platform, we're also providing attribution. Each data set has its own DOI, the teams are represented, so it is very easy to cite this. And those citations investigators can bring into their NIH biosketches as a worthy scientific contribution. Now, the Agora platform, as I said, was important for us because the primary end user of these data sets and analysis were computational biologists, but we wanted to bring the output close to biologists. So Agora provides the curated genomic analysis that have been vetted, or meta-analysis. So if you are not interested in the AMPD targets, you can actually check out how your gene of interest performs on these. But you can actually look at all the 542 unique target nominations along with the associated evidence, including druggability information, which was put together by the pharma partners. Now, we ended up with this fountain of targets, and then we thought, well, we are going to run to another bottleneck. Who is going to now develop tools to advance these targets and to use these tools to learn more about disease biology and to advance them into drug discovery? So last year, we launched a funding initiative where we raised the bar on open science and we brought open science to drug discovery, and actually asked the community to put together applications, new center applications that are highly cross-disciplinary, the mission of which will be to develop open source tools, reagents, and methods that for robust preclinical validation of these nascent targets, and to integrate a subset of these enabled targets into drug discovery campaigns. We launched 2 centers just this October, and we're pleased to have among the midst of the fabulous teams who will be working on this, the Structural Genomics Consortium, the team led by Alain Edwards, who is going to bring the open drug development model that they have pioneered into this new infrastructure. So again, this is meant to, the output of these centers is meant to help biologists at large to use these tools to study basic biology of disease, and academicians, biotech, people in biotech and pharma to build on this and launch their drug discovery campaigns. We are building, as I mentioned, the entire translational infrastructure from targets to trials and embedding these principles throughout. One of our other key pieces here is the Model AD Center, which is developing the next generation of animal models for Alzheimer's disease based on sporadic late onset risk factors, where all the data, methods, animal models are distributed freely without licensing fees and IP barriers. So since the launch of the AMPD Target Discovery Program, we have launched 3 other target discovery consortia. Again, we're trying to deconstruct disease complexity. All these entities together are actually using the big data infrastructure of the Knowledge Portal and Agora. They're pulling from it and enriching the data sets in it. The features of this new infrastructure are integration is one of the key themes. We're integrating across clinical genomic translational research, computational and experimental approaches. We're integrating across insights from animal models and data from humans, and bringing together academic and industry expertise. I'll end with this, that This is the NIH Research Summit said this 3 times or every time we get together, that it is necessary not just to change the academic publishing and funding incentive. I would say it's necessary to align them, because it is a 3-legged stool, and to put open science on a good footing, they really need to move in concert. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
I think that's a great slide to leave as we take questions. So I would open the floor for questions. Excellent. We'll go ahead here. Urs?
Maybe for Alain, are there within the European Union larger attempts to open up this open science topic, or is the same kind of a trailblazer?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
Parmi l'Union européenne, est-ce que c'est la France avec le CNRS qui est vraiment dirigeant le débat, ou c'est l'Union européenne
No, no, it's in each country there is several approach, different approach in different countries. For example, we have not the same approach as in Germany. They are looking for the publication. They are working for what they call gold open science, which is the same as it's better. Okay. You pay when you it's a writer which pays the publication, and not the when you read the paper. We don't believe in this system, but we have the same goal, but not each time the same approach. Each year we have a meeting in Berlin where we have the people who are discussing with the publisher of 6 or 7 countries. And we discuss together to go in the same direction. So we are not leading. We are working with our other countries.
Thank you. Dominique?
Just
You're
a
next.
follow-up to that question. So, from what I understand, you're not, like the CNRS is not adopting Plan S, basically. They're going ahead with some other type of model.
Okay, Plan S it's a plan for agencies. And CNRS is not an agency. CNRS is an organization where we have a researcher, and so we are not an agency. And Plan S, it's but we agree with what is inside the Plan S. But the Plan S is the goal is to have 100% of publication in open science, whatever the way where you get the open science.
So what you're encouraging is the green open access, right? If I understand properly, like you're encouraging researchers to post public postprints of their papers.
What really I believe it's what we call the diamond open access.
Okay.
Diamond open access is just to develop platforms, alternative platforms. We have in discipline like mathematics, you have in France like Saint-Mersenne, we have also in social and social science and humanities. There exists, we have shown something in life science, so in biology and things we have. For example, there is an example in Germany, which is Copernicus, which is a fully non-public organization, which don't receive any money from the public, but we just is non-profit organization too, and which so you pay the services at the price where you have to pay the service. So we really believe in what we call the bibliodiversity, this alternative solutions. You have also the AP review in informatics and.
Thank you. So I saw 2 questions, one here and one there. We'll go in this order. Yeah.
Thank you for coming and organizing and coming to share with us today. As I understand it, one of the goals also of open science is giving access to scientists from other countries who maybe do not have the resources or the access to these kinds of collaborations. So here we have Canada, US, France, the EU, all countries with a lot of powerful science infrastructure. But there's other barriers to political, geopolitical, economic for scientists participating. do you guys have some comments about, for instance, if are all of these things that you've described, are they open to scientists, say, from Iran, China, not to say a value judgment on that, but is that something that enters into the discourse, especially with concerns about geopolitical concerns and how open science might be in conflict with that?
I can say that the data sets and the infrastructure that we've put in place and what we're pushing out through it is available. The goal is to democratize the use and really globally, not just in the US, as AD is a global disease. And we do have the user statistics tells us that the data sets are being used globally. So same for the animal model. These resources are really, it's made to be responsible but non-onerous access to data and tools.
Yep. Okay, we'll take a question over there. Then if I may, I'll ask a question that I think would be relevant for the audience, and then we'll go to you after.
Thank you, Dr. Schuhl.
I don't really understand. The question is, I don't understand the question.
You mentioned one of your
Yes.
steps.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that in more detail?
What it's okay. Training for me, it's you know, we are working with a researcher. And for example, we are developing now open science, and they heard about open science something last time, 5 or 10 years ago, and now we have to go and to explain them that things change, and now we have tools to now the solution we have can be realistic, and we can do that. So that's the first point, and the second point, it's just to recall things very simple. That's a publication which is in open science has a better impact than publication which is not in open science. So the dissemination of a result is things like that. So what we call training is just explanation of what is our plan, what is the reality of the number and the fact, which is important.
Thank you. The question that I was burning to ask both panelists is about early career researchers, and in your experience, what are the advantages of using open science for the early career, or maybe the fears that you've been hearing? I was wondering if you can elaborate on that.
Thank you for that question. So as we were conceiving these new programs and trying to define the terms and conditions for funding and launch these, so what we heard, and this was not from the young investigators, this was from the senior investigators, that this will just destroy the young investigators, that this would just negatively impact their ability to be competitive. And so, yes, that was concern of ours. So again, this was an experiment. So what we have observed, a couple of things. Within the investigators, the young investigators who participate in the large consortia have really benefited from being part of these large teams, participating in team science, and because of the access to all the data and all the other toys, we have seen them step in and lead and do exceedingly well. They were, a number of them in the course of those 5 years were able to secure their all large NIH grants. And again, we see them daily. It's been very heartening to see that they are really the next generation of leaders and that this has accelerated that for them. On the outside, though, young investigators who are outside, part of the reason why we're doing this is because we want to allow big labs and small labs to contribute to Alzheimer's disease research. And it's particularly important for somebody who has a small lab who is just starting, does not have the funds or the time to spend to generate these high quality, very sophisticated data sets, but has the know-how to use them. So we see that young investigators at large are using these data sets. They're putting them in their grant applications. We continue to promote the uptake of this, and we were able to build other funding opportunities that then again encourages investigators to use these data sets and do something new with them. So far, I'm sure this is not all rosy, probably. This is just the information and what I can observe from what I work on. I think this would be even more beneficial for young investigators if the promotion committees in academia were rewarding open science practices. So I feel that until that changes in earnest, it will still, there will be a lag between the push we make and encouragement we give and the real uptake of that behavior and practice and propagation.
Would you like to tackle that question, or?
Just maybe it's a little bit okay. We have a community, we have a discipline which are very in advance in open science. If you look at astrophysics,
Yeah.
because they know they have to store the data and to give the data open. For example, if you look at the Hubble telescope, 60% of the publication are done by people who just use the data which has been opened. And it can be done by young or not young researcher, but the data are available, and so if you have an idea about the data, you can use the data. So there is more publication which are not directly by people who did the experiment than people who just use the data after.
Okay, we're running very close to the end, but perhaps we can have a concise last question, a few concise answers to that.
It's a very, very good question. Now there is an initiative from the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, which is the Health Data Hub. So we just want to collect a lot of health data, but we have to keep the confidentiality. We just do have to be able to. But the goal is to put all this data in one platform and then to be used by a lot of researchers, but also but artificial intelligence to help to invent a new medicines and things like that. So yes, there is I will not say a contradiction, but we have to find what is the way to go and to share the data, but to keep the confidentiality.
Excellent. Do you have anything to add to this, or?
I think this was about the contradiction between
Yeah.
privacy and openness. Yes, and this is something, a line that we always have to thread and be very mindful of. The platform that, the big data infrastructure we have built, and this is not the only one, we take great care in making sure that the governance of data, depending on the data source and the data type, is appropriate so that the protections of privacy are in place as best as we know. Again, it is very important to be upfront about this, and as they say, ask for permission and not forgiveness, because the consequences are real. But yes, that is a kind of
Thank you. With that, I would like to thank our panelists for providing these two very different perspectives from different parts of the world, from the funder perspective and then from the administration perspective on going to the same place. And I hope with more events like this, we will see kind of more international harmonization among international harmonization and open science efforts, since we're all here for the same reason, to make science more open and make the future of science open by default. So thank you.
Okay, I think we can start. So my name is Viviane Poupon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this breakout session that will discuss some of the issues around intellectual property and open science, as well as present some practical tools presenters develop for researchers to structure their open science collaborations. So this is meant to be an interactive session. It will start with a presentation by Dylan to give some overview about the agreements we're talking today, but really please feel free to interrupt him. And also there'll be some time for question and discussion at the end. So I'll present our two speakers. I'll start with Richard. So Dr. Richard Gould is a James McGill Professor at McGill University Faculty of Law and a founding director of the Center for Intellectual Property Policy. He teaches in the area of intellectual property and innovation, and his research centers on the interaction between innovation, development and commerce, and particularly with respect to the biosector and biotechnology. He has provided advice for many Canadian and international governmental organizations, from Health Canada and Industry Canada to OECD, the World Health Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and UNITAID. He's been a close collaborator of the Neuro and the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute from the start, with the development of a Neuro Open Science Guiding Principle, and is also leading the effort to develop international standard measures for open science so that institutions and government can assess its impact on research and innovation. Our second speaker, Dr. Dylan Roscombe-Edris, he just joined the Tannenbaum Open Science Institute as our Open Science Alliance Officer. And Dylan's background is in neuroscience, health ethics, and law, and specializing in intellectual property. And so his current projects involve studying how commercialization and open science can work together for the public good and creating the tools necessary to bring the forces of open science and the market together. So with this introduction, I'll let you, Dylan, start.
Very much. Hop up here. I really hope this works. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the session. My name, as Vivian just pointed out, is Dylan Roscombe-Edris. I'll be presenting today on what we're calling implementing open science. In case that isn't 100% clear, what Richard and I have been working on over the last little while, and what we're going to be continuing to work on, is figuring out some of the contracts and some of the legal mechanisms around intellectual property, but also elsewhere, that allow open science to happen. Let's have a look. My plan is to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to have little pauses in there in case you want to ask questions, but also I'm an extremely responsive guy. So if you just want to pop up your hand at any point or shout out an interruption, I'm happy to take your questions then and there. The idea is that with 20 minutes of discussion, we should have plenty of time for chatting and discussing afterwards. So when most people think about open science, they think about a scientist and how they conduct research. Maybe they think about how they share that research with another researcher directly, or with a research community through something like a repository, or simply being an incredibly generous individual and sending a whole bunch of their stuff, materials, code, data, out into the open. However, unless we zoom out, we don't see that those collective and research efforts are embedded in a vast network of relationships that exist between science, academic institutions, funders, patient advocacy groups. It's a vast network of relationships upon which scientific research is embedded and upon which it relies. And in order for open science to be successful, you need to take into account all of these different relationships. Now, to preface everything that I'm going to be talking about, Before the IT information technology revolution, there was a significant transfer gap in terms of distance and difficulty transferring scientific resources from one person from one scientist to another scientist. After the IT revolution, this transfer gap shrunk and is continuing to shrink to the point where now data and software can be shared near instantly. In fact, if you were in the other session, or if somehow you can be in two places at once, you'd hear about open notebooks are allowing researchers to share protocols on a weekly or daily or even live basis. There are people who live stream the research that they conduct. However, for a relationship to be successful, you can't just shrink the transfer gap. You need to pay attention to the trust gap, because a powerful relationship and an effective one depends not just on the ease of transfer, but on trust between individuals. These can be scientists, they can be funders and scientists, they can be patient advocacy groups with expertise to share with scientists that they can get there. Now, how do we shrink this trust gap? There are a couple of different options. One is you don't pay attention to the trust gap. You just share everything as widely as you possibly can. You know, you work on mice and you share all of your data as widely as you ever could. Another is, as you'll have listened to Jane Roskams, who is my inimitable mother, talked about this morning. She shared data even before data sharing was cool, but only with people who, you know, she could share a beer with, who she'd met at conferences. This is also extremely common within the scientific space. It's informal and does not represent the equal opportunity sharing that open science needs to thrive. In particular, how do you make sure that when you're sharing, you do so for the purposes of discovery, education, and the public good, which are the values that underlie McGill as a university, as well as any academic institution? And also how do you ensure that the other person who receives the resource uses it responsibly in a way that, for example, limits liabilities, ensures that they know that there's what the resources can be used for and cannot be used for are independent, make sure that they respect any patient privacy interests. There's a magical tool that in many cases works fantastically. This tool is contracts. It's a way of noting down the common understanding of the parties and developing trust that is available, as long as you can do them in a standard and template way, to everybody who wants to be involved. Now, in the old way of doing things, here's how we handled it. Responsible use was handled by things like protective clauses. So you've got things like limiting liability. And then discovery, education, and the public good were supposed to be handled by intellectual property, by making sure that everybody got their piece, making sure everybody knew exactly what was able to be sub-licensed and owned and haggling about all of the different components, and that somehow this would, through a market mechanism, lead to the betterment of all discovery, education, and ultimately the public good. The protective clauses are pretty good. They actually end up working. They're accepted by institutions. They're legally enforceable, and they develop a common understanding for use. The IP clauses, however, not so much, especially in terms of neuroscience. Why, we have to ask, has this IP protectionism model failed? Well, here's a couple of different reasons. One, property ownership isn't actually what most scientists and physicians, the people who are actually doing the research, care about. I've been looking at some of the technology transfer data coming out of McGill. Of the 84 current faculty members, only 29 have ever made an ROI, and only 5 of those have ever made, which is a report of invention, the first step on the traditional university intellectual property commercialization set. Only 5 ever made more than 3. The vast majority have only made 2 or less. What this indicates is that physicians are interested in treating patients and researchers are interested in conducting basic research to develop our common understanding. They're not interested in obtaining patents. 2, especially when we're talking about neuroscience, we're still working out the basics. We know a lot, but what has been revealed consistently is that when it comes to ALS, when it comes to multiple sclerosis, when it comes to Parkinson's disease, when it comes to Alzheimer's, we do not know enough to be able to pop down your property right and allow that to be a successful piece to be shuffled around within the market. What this leads to is early and overeager intellectual property strategy in an area that is insufficiently explored, and for a set of phenomena, the human brain, possibly the most complicated thing that the universe has ever thrown up. When we take that and we try to parcel that out as property early on in a way that has worked for some, telecommunications and stuff in the past, you end up getting knowledge, IP protecting knowledge that could potentially lead to a product, as opposed to IP over products that can actually be useful for delivering them to the patients and the public that they're actually going to help. They have little worth, and they inject long delays. Open science is the answer to developing this common model. We understand this at the Neuro, which is why we decided to go full bore into it. It requires working together. It requires sharing our resources and sharing credit, as has been brought up several times earlier today, most notably in Dario's talk about open source software. You need to be able to share credit even if things are made openly available. You should be able to track use, both in terms of trust, which Will Banks just spoke about, as well as in terms of sharing credit. And you need to be able to need to have a consensus not to claim IP rights that are restrictive early on. However, we just don't have the contracts, that magical instrument that I was talking to you about earlier, yet. We're trying to use these old strategies and these old contracts to apply to open science, and they just aren't working. So, the thing that Richard and I have been working on, and will continue to be working on, we're calling the Open Science Agreements Toolkit. We're trying to develop a toolkit of standard agreements that can be used to structure the relationships between anybody who's engaging in open science. The paradigmatic case is two scientists, but really it can be anyone within that vast network of science, in which science is embedded that I was just talking about earlier. We based our approach on the Lambert Toolkit, which was developed by the Intellectual Property Office of the United Kingdom, but with an open science orientation. Because if you look at the documents in the Lambert Toolkit, the vast majority of the text within each of the different agreements is about haggling over who has exclusive rights, who is going to be able to sublicense things, who they're going to be able to do it to, why they're going to be able to do it, for what purposes. Standard agreements have two main benefits. When you increase the terms, the certainty of terms, so if everybody's looking at the same agreement, even if they're modifying it, everybody's starting from a common understanding, we're getting back to open science here, you increase the certainty of the parties and you increase the likelihood that they're going to be able to come to agreement. Not only do you increase the likelihood of it happening, you reduce the negotiation time from what can be months and years to weeks. A great example of this, and I encourage you to go talk to Jason Karamchandani about this, who runs the CBIG effort here, the CBIG repository, is that by using the MTA that they've developed for the CBIG repository, they've been able to, which heavily influenced some of the work that we're going to be doing, they've been able to drop the transfer time from up to a year to a week. So what we're trying to do is provide an alternative, trying to give you the contracts that you need to be able to do open science. In order to develop the first installment of the OSAT, we identified a couple of key relationships. Researcher to researcher, one-time transfers, usually handled by MTAs, so we developed the Open Science Material and Data Transfer Agreement. Another very key relationship is funder to scientist or funder to research group, because only if you provide the scientists with the resources and the money that they need to do their work, can they do it, but a lot of funders are interested in making sure that the results are released in an open fashion. We also wanted to look at what if two groups want to collaborate in an open science-based way on a particular project, a time-limited project. So we wanted to develop a open science project agreement. And then, perhaps the most ambitious one is, what if you have a couple of different groups of any given type, whether they're nonprofit, research, industry, that want to be able to work together on an ongoing basis, on a particular shared interest, developing common models? Well, for that, we wanted to give you the Open Science Collaboration Agreement. The OSAT, the documents that we've released so far, which are really, I call them beta versions, but they're alpha versions, are up online. You can access them on Zenodo. You can access them on the Open Science Framework, developed by Brian Nozick at the Center for Open Science, which you also heard John Wilbanks just talk about. Please go on there, download them, have a look. We want to have all of your input we possibly can, because we can't do it alone. We're just two guys. You download the agreement. They're uploaded in .doc format. So yeah, please take a picture. I see some of you people taking a picture. That's probably the best way for you to get that, because you can't click on the link in reality, unfortunately. Download it in .doc format. We did it in .doc format so that they're maximally modifiable, because we want your comments. Another great thing about the Open Science Framework is that you can actually fork a project. So if you have an account, you go on there and say, fork project. It'll create your own copy for it. Modify within there, play it in your sandbox, and that'll be linked back to the original upload. These are open science tools that we're using for more like open science legal development. We also developed what's called a human-readable summary for each document, which is a maximally non-legalistic description of each of the different components. Because even for lawyers, contracts can be a bit of a slog. There's a lot of legal jargon and legal syntax that can be difficult to put into context. Thank you, Creative Commons, for the idea of a human-readable summary. I got it directly from them. Thank you, John Wilbanks, not in the room, unfortunately. The areas that need to be filled in, highlighted in yellow, should be easily indicated and described in the human-readable summary, and in-document guidance is offered and indicated by putting things in asterisk, putting it in bold, and putting it in green, so you know that if you're going to use one of the agreements that you've modified, take that out first. The entire agreement is provided, but non-key provisions can easily be modified to fit your institutional context. I'm going to go through each agreement now. I'm going to try to do it in as accessible a way as possible. Just a couple of slides. I'm going to stop after each agreement. Please, if you have comments, say them then, or save them until afterwards if you want to talk a little bit more. So the idea behind the Open Materials Data and Transfer Agreement, the awesome data, if you want to have something a little bit shorter and it kind of sounds like awesome data, which is a nice name, if I do say so myself, was designed for sending physical materials, software, and data, or some combination thereof, from one person to another person in a one-time transfer. It can be used by researchers, institutions, and repositories. And why do you want to use it? Well, usually to reduce IP barriers, to actually promote sharing, because the best practices in sharing are actually noted in there. We try to encourage people to use fair practices and so on and so forth, but like I said, I'm not going to get into the actual language of the contract. And then sharing credit through the use of persistent digital identifiers, so metrics can be developed so that if you use the resource that has been sent to you, the person who was responsible for creating it can go, look, I contributed by sending this, and I can show that in numbers and put it on my grant application. It's got distinct open science elements that make it very different from your material transfer agreement. All those parts within your traditional material transfer agreement that talk about if you make something out of it and it turns out to be patentable, then I have to be able to sublicense it back from you, or you are only allowed to sublicense it to nonprofit entities, or we get a cut of whatever your sublicensing revenues. We've taken all those out. The idea here isn't to apportion property rights and through that build trust. The idea is for everybody involved to go, no, we're not claiming property over any of this. When we're talking about the brain, nobody understands enough about the landscape of the brain for us possibly to be able to accurately draw property borderlines around what is appropriate knowledge to be turned into property for the market. So, if you look into Article 5, Article 6, and Article 3.2, which is an interesting viral transfer provision that we're experimenting with, so if you want to be able to send the data on and make sure it's happening in an open science way, please go in, have a look at those. However, I also want to point out that while there are these differences, there are also all of the other provisions about protecting the interests of the people who are sending it. So making sure that there's limitations of liability, making sure that there's warranties and indemnifications, and all of those little bits of the contract that aren't reflected in your open science MTAs that you might find elsewhere, which are usually extremely bare bones and aren't accepted by your standard technology transfer office, for example. I'm going to be moving on to another contract, but does anybody have any? Yeah? Yes, so the Open MTA from the BioBricks and their Open MTA that were developed by their plant component was definitely one of the major influences on the development of this and one of the motivations for doing so. What we wanted to do was take what we were doing specifically at the Neuro and at the SGC, who was another big collaborator, and kind of adapt that to do something similar. But if you know about licenses, current MTAs are full copyright. And the BioBricks Open Science Agreement is kind of like an MIT license. It's super permissive. Yep. So we wanted to aim kind of somewhere in the middle there. We're not saying that it's the best, and absolutely it's what you have to use, but there have to be other options. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, you go ahead.
Have any of these contracts been tested in court? Has anyone taken any? They were uploaded Saturday.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is also why we're releasing them now, right? Because we want people to be able to go on there, and maybe there's something in there. I'll come back to you, Mark, I promise. Maybe there's something in there that another lawyer will come in and look at and be like, no, this won't hold up because of X, Y, and Z. It's that kind of criticism that we need to make these arguments or these agreements as good as we possibly can. It's like open sourcing.
But it was built on BioBricks and JSON.
And the MTA that was developed for
So
use
it's
at the
not-
CBIG
they're
repository.
not brand new agreements drafted. Was there any testing or did anyone push those in court?
Not,
There are not that many MPAs
not yet.
subject to lawsuits.
No. And as far as I know, none of the ones that have been used for transferring materials from CBIG have been tested in court. Vivian's shaking her head. So it seems to me that usually when you're testing things in court, it's either irresponsible use, which has not been a problem, or someone's using them to make money in a way that was not allowed within the MTA. And the whole point right now with the CBIG repository is not to be making money. It's not to be giving someone something they're going to be using to make money. It's to develop basic models, as well as to sometimes diagnose patients. Sometimes, one of the reasons that's so frustrating about these long transfer delays is that sometimes they're not just being used for science, which is frustrating enough if you have a 12-month delay, but they're actually being used to help patients. And if they have to wait 12 months to have some kind of reagent sent from point A to point B, that's unacceptable. Mark, do you have another?
So you just touched a bit on termination.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting concept in open science. You want to terminate something that is open.
Yeah.
So let's go to the C-bigger example.
Mhm.
Neuro transfer some samples to a group. The group makes a fantastic discovery. Their discovery is licensed to a pharma and they make money. But the money goes to patient because of advanced clinical trials. But would that be a termination reason, or what do you have in mind?
So termination here,
termination of an agreement, such an agreement.
Two things. First of all, termination here mostly refers to just the kind of natural ending of the contract, as
Okay,
opposed
so not
to
cause or
not cause, we're suing you for breach or something along those lines. And two, baked into it is that if I send you something, you're not using it to develop an protected innovation, right? So I'm not going to be licensing a patent that I got out of something that was transferred to you because you've agreed by signing the Open Science Material Transfer Agreement that the materials and modifications that you make of it and results are going to be released in an open way. So, yeah.
So why would a company do this?
Because,
Trying to start neurotech in Montreal?
sure, in which case you might want another option. But
Not necessarily, because
Okay.
just because you take the materials doesn't mean you can't patent for any reason at any time whatsoever. You're not giving up your entire future. You're just saying in respect of this, you're going to share this knowledge, the materials. You're not going to patent this thing in a way that prevents other people from using this material. If you derive something else, that's outside the scope. So what we want to do is create a bubble of openness, and we don't want anybody clogging up that bubble by applying for patents. But outside that bubble, go ahead and do whatever you want.
So what was the same delineation between knowledge and product? We're talking mainly about knowledge, using that material for knowledge generation. Whenever there's a product that arises, of course, in the industrial environment, it's going to go
So this is really about creating freedom to operate, and so we need people to promise not to patent to interfere with freedom to operate. And there is some subtlety we added in on the IP provision that we will allow some patents to the extent, and only to the extent that they're there to guarantee freedom to operate. This happened with the core, the Linux core, for example. There are a whole bunch of patents that the foundation created in order to protect the core from other people patenting it. So mutually assured destruction. So there's a little bit of subtlety in there, but the goal is to create a bubble and not allow people to patent within it so that that material stays free. But once you've used the material and created something different, then you're outside the scope of the.
And I think, one thing that I just want to remind of is that patenting, for example, treatments for Alzheimer's disease based on studies that have been done in mice has a 99% failure rate, and nothing has been developed over the last 50 years. So we're trying to giving people tools to move away from patenting early on when we don't have a great model. Adrian, you had a question. Mm-hmm. I mean, please, please, please.
Grants are going in to do that. This is the knowledge mobilization part. We're also working with the OECD. We're hoping the government of Canada helps fund it, for those of you from the government of Canada, to actually use the OECD, who's very interested in open science, as a place to discuss it, and then that builds up a consensus. So this agreements, as they stand, are not standing form agreements yet because they haven't been fully accepted by everybody. But the next step is to get buy-in from funders. Certain funders come in and say, yeah, we want to use that. Work through the OECD to try to get some international consensus around it. Meetings like this. We're also opening up the agreements to commentary with the expectation they'll change, again, to get buy-in. But the buy-in process is critical. It's uncertain because it's unfunded. So if you have funding ideas for how to do that.
Well, this is also one of the things that's so incredibly exciting for me, because I was just brought on as the Open Science Alliance Officer for the Neuro. This gives me a unique position to be able to go to other institutions and try to build relationships with them so that we can begin using, we've been using strategies like these. We can tell them what's worked and what hasn't, and we can try to talk with them to develop a consensus around using these types of approaches. Okay, I'm going to go on. Next agreement that I wanted to talk about is a funding agreement. So another key relationship that we developed or that we looked at is the provision of funding. So let's say a funder wants to fund a particular project, but wants to make sure that anything that comes out of it is openly accessible. I mean, this is kind of what is expected in some cases, but isn't always the result. We've designed it to be relatively broad, trying to be public as well as private funders. We've had those same elements. If you develop something, no restrictive IP. This still means that you can, for example, maintain copyright and put a permissive license on it. Because there's utility in that sometimes. Because if you release it to the public domain and someone else comes by and says, actually, no, I'm claiming ownership over this, you can point to your right. You can say, no, it's mine, but I've given the right. I've given permission to everyone else to use it for whatever purposes they like. We also want people to publish open access. And then one thing I want to highlight is in Article 2.5 and 2.6, you give explicit permission to use funds to offset open access publishing costs, as well as any reasonable costs associated with making your resources available and sharing them with the rest of the scientific community. Because that is often one of the barriers identified by researchers who want to publish open access, but realize that it costs in the journal that they target $5,000 to do so. Admittedly, that's, maybe that model will change, but under current circumstances, that's one of the barriers that we identify. Once again, all exactly the same protective provisions. This is a sophisticated legal agreement that you'd find in a standard set of funding, a standard set of funding conditions or a funding agreement. We wanted to provide people to be provided with something that is full and sophisticated, something that they could use after they've adapted and after we've developed it. Okay, that's the OSFA, the Open Science Funding Agreement. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah.
I was thinking about, can you back slide? I was thinking about the openly shared data and how are these things tracked and measured and how,
Yeah.
Is there any connection to the GoFair initiative? Because I think they're working on a data ecosystem for how to evaluate that.
Not explicitly. FAIR principles, yes, but the GoFair initiative specifically, no. I should write that down. I'll come back to you. Okay, if there's no more questions, moving on to the next agreement. We wanted to have a project agreement, so let's say 2 entities. They might do research groups, they might be industry, they might be two academic groups want to work together to create an assay, for example, or to work together to test with one group cell line, a library of molecules that's had by another, but they both want to make sure that all of the results are released as openly as possible. We've allowed it to be 2 or more collaborators, but the really thing that defines this is it's a project with a defined kind of end date and objective, which differentiates it. Well, once again, the same open science characteristics. I don't need to keep bashing you over the head with those. And the fact that it's a sophisticated legal agreement. Right, I should have mentioned this. I put keys next to what are key provisions, ones that you should be pretty careful if you want to modify and change, because, for example, changing definitions, as any lawyer will tell you, can lead to unintended consequences for how the rest of the contract functions. Then there's the Open Science Collaboration Agreement, where you want to have an ongoing effort between perhaps a research group, patient advocacy group, and a industry group, or whatever combination you like. They all have a shared interest, they all have expertise or resources to contribute, but they all want to make sure that anything that comes out of it is shared as openly as possible. This can happen in early development of tools, which is vital in an area like neuroscience where we only have the barest glimmer of the tools we're going to need to really understand in a deep and meaningful way, in a way that actually lets us help patients, the phenomena that we're looking at, the human nervous system. Once again, sophisticated legal agreement. It gets a little bit more complicated here because you have a governance structure that we've put in there and suggested, but you can modify if you like. But then, of course, we come to this. What about commercialization? I'm only going to take a couple of minutes on this because a lot of people are supportive of open science. A lot of people that you talk to are supportive of open science 90% of the way. And then it gets to commercialization, and they go, how am I going to work with industry to actually deliver this to patients? Don't we need intellectual property? Don't we need to be patenting things as early as possible? Basically, what we need to do is figure out a way to take that trust gap between a bunch of stakeholders, physicians, patients, scientists, institutions, and industry, reduce it to work on a common basis to deliver to patients and the public the products that are actually going to help them. This is an unsolved issue in an area currently being explored. I wish I could come up here and tell you exactly what was going to happen. However, I'm going to highlight a couple of things. The M4K model that we heard about earlier today relies on regulatory exclusivity, allows a massive sharing of data, and nonetheless gives sufficient protection in order to give some kind of market position. You need that. Another example is the development of the WDR5 inhibitor, once again, and an involvement with the SGC. What you had there, to do it very briefly, is a collaborative effort to develop a probe for a protein that was indicated in a number of types of cancer. All of that was publicly shared. All of the work was publicly shared. However, then one of the partners was able to, their drug development wing, was able to take the know-how that they developed. It was all openly shared, but you gain a certain level of experience when it comes to working on a project. Take the probe that was openly developed, that was openly released, and other publicly accessible information, so all operating in the public, design a change to it to be an actually more effective inhibitor and potentially a drug target, or sorry, potentially a drug to affect this target in a way that was marketable, caused massive investment from Celgene, a company from the United States, and allowed to fund a Canadian clinical trial. The essence of what I'm trying to talk about, and I'm almost at the end here, I promise, is on one hand, you want to release as much information as you possibly can. We need to work together, and we need to share information to be able to do so. However, there needs to be some way, when you're doing commercialization, to enter into some kind of exclusivity or some advantage, something that actually lets industry take a hold and release it to the market in a way that can actually get to patients. There are a couple of ways of doing this. Regulatory exclusivity I already talked about. The know-how based plus later IP, which is the WDR5 example I talked about. Or you can have, as was once again talked about, governments, nonprofits, philanthropy, fund the research, and then if it gets appropriated at some point down the way and leads to an actual product by a competitor, that's fine, because what the funders are actually interested in is developing a product, is having a product developed. There are other options that are currently being explored. I just put those up with question marks so that they might be topics of discussion. Obviously, there are serious red flags when you think about any of those things. But just in the spirit of having as much on the table as we possibly can as fodder for discussion, I wanted to include them in the PowerPoint. Future directions. This is when you know you're getting towards the end of the presentation. For you, they're up online right now. Please go find them, hack them. I'm good at taking criticism. Please, you can go on OSF and comment. You can be like, these are terrible. You need to change this, and you need to change this, and you need to change this. All you'll get from me is thanks and probably acknowledgement in any kind of later downstream, because if even if it's coming in and being critical and tearing apart, if you've contributed in a material way to getting these agreements in a form where they can actually be used and turned into a standard, I'll give you credit out the wazoo, please. I want to collect comments just to give you a little bit of background about what it maybe you're in a jurisdiction where the terms that we've used aren't relevant. Maybe they're not as easy to use as I thought because I'm legally trained and that infects the mind in ways that are beautiful and also sinister. There might be different languages that are needed, and if there are other types of agreements that you can identify, confidentiality agreements even, though that seems a little antithetical to open science. I plan on collecting comments and uploading what I would call beta versions, because really these are alpha versions that I've got on there, because it's just been us working on it for now. I want to facilitate the use, modification, and resharing and uptake of these OSAT documents and stakeholders, and I'm uniquely positioned to be able to do so as the Open Science Alliance Officer for TOSI. I want to track how they're used and modified, and then develop templates for other agreements that we identify as necessary and that can benefit from having a shared understanding from which parties can start. Happy to receive questions. Look at that. Link, that should have been the link. I can go back to the other link at the very beginning if you want to take another picture, if you missed the opportunity to get the Zenodo and the Open Science Framework link. You can also email to myself or Richard if you would like to. Please, we're happy to receive anyway. On OSF, you can actually comment directly on there, which would be amazing. And then after receiving feedback, this is an ongoing project. I want this to continue going. We're going to be trying to put template consent forms for open science up on there. We're going to be trying to figure out how to implement some of these agreements online, if that would be useful. And really try to make it provide the documents and agreements that are needed to facilitate relationships on an open science basis in as broad a way as possible. And thanks to the Neuro, to HBL for some funding, and the Structural Genomics Consortium for all sorts of input. And that's it. Thank you for listening.